My entire team at work got laid off except me. I spent the next 6 months figuring out why I was the one they kept, and what I found out changed how I see every job I've ever had. The day it happened was a Thursday, which I mention because there is a specific cruelty to a Thursday layoff that I have thought about many times since. Monday would be brutal but legible, the week beginning with a demolition, at least giving you 4 days to start rebuilding before the weekend. Friday is the classic, the one that gets the reputation, the clear your desk and go home and have 2 days before you have to figure out what comes next. But Thursday is something else. Thursday means one more day of work after the worst professional day of your life, one more day in the building where the desks have been emptied, logging into the same systems under the same login credentials, answering emails that arrive with the same subject lines they always had, as if the institutional memory of the organization has not yet caught up with what the organization just did to itself. Thursday means you sit in a quieter office on Friday, watching the absence of people who were there on Wednesday, and trying to remember what your face is supposed to be doing. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 36 years old, and at the time this story begins I was a mid-level data analyst at a company I will call Corvin Group, a financial services software firm based in Portland, Oregon, with about 400 employees and the specific culture of a company that had grown fast enough to develop complexity, but not fast enough to develop wisdom about that complexity. It was not a bad place to work. The work was interesting, the pay was fair. The people on my immediate team were the kind of people you genuinely look forward to seeing on a Monday morning, which is rarer than it should be, and which I did not fully appreciate until the Monday after the Thursday when they were gone. There were 7 of us on the analytics team. After the layoff, there was 1. I want to be precise about what the layoff looked like from the inside, because I think precision matters here, and because the temptation in stories like this is to flatten the event into a clean before and after, when the reality is considerably messier and more gradual and more human than that. The rumors had been circulating for about 6 weeks, the kind of rumors that circulate in every organization periodically, and that most people process as ambient noise until they don't. Revenue targets missed, a restructuring consultancy brought in, meetings behind glass walls that people tried not to visibly strain to interpret, the standard repertoire of organizational anxiety. Our manager, a woman named Dana who had built the analytics team from scratch over 4 years, and who was, by any honest measure, the reason the team functioned as well as it did, had told us 2 weeks before the Thursday that she had been given assurances that analytics was considered a core function and that we should not be concerned. I believe she believed this when she said it. I believe the assurances were real at the time they were given and became untrue later, which is how these things often work, not through deliberate deception, but through the way that decisions made at the top of organizations travel downward imprecisely, changing shape as they go. On the Thursday, we were called into a conference room in groups. Dana went first alone, for about 15 minutes. She came out looking like someone who had been told something that had changed the structural load-bearing of her face. Then the others went in pairs with HR. Each pair came out carrying the cardboard boxes that HR had, with planning that felt both practical and slightly dystopian, pre-positioned near the conference room door. I was called in last, alone. The HR director was a man named Philip, who I had interacted with exactly twice before that day, and who had the manner of someone who has delivered difficult news so many times that the difficulty has worn smooth, not through callousness but through repetition. He told me in clear and not unkind terms that the analytics team was being restructured, that 6 positions were being eliminated, and that my position was being retained. I sat with that sentence for a moment. Mine specifically, I said. Your role is being retained, Philip said. The scope will change. There will be a conversation about that in the coming weeks. Why mine? I said. Philip looked at me with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected a different set of questions at this point in the conversation. Most people, I imagine, asked about severance packages, about references, about what happened to their benefits. I was asking why I was the one who didn't have to ask those questions. That's a decision made above my level, Philip said, which was either true or the most diplomatic possible non-answer, and I have never determined which. I walked back to my desk. Around me, my 6 colleagues were at various stages of the process of leaving, some already gone, some making quiet phone calls. One, a man named Derek who had been at Corvin for 11 years and who I considered the most competent person on the team by a significant margin, sitting very still at his desk, looking at nothing with the focused expression of someone processing something too large to process quickly. I wanted to say something to him. I stood near his desk for a moment and could not find the sentence. He looked up, saw my face, understood immediately that I was the one they'd kept, and gave me a nod that contained more generosity than I deserved, and went back to looking at nothing. I sat at my desk for the rest of the afternoon, and did not do a single productive thing, which was the most honest response available to me. The first week after the layoff was one of the stranger weeks of my professional life, and I have had some strange ones. The office had the quality of a place that has been interrupted mid-sentence, projects half-finished, processes broken at the point where they had passed from someone else's hands to mine, institutional knowledge distributed across 6 people who were no longer there. I had a one-on-one with my new direct manager, a vice president named Renata who oversaw 3 different departments, and who was adding analytics to her portfolio the way you add a task to a to-do list that is already too long. She was efficient and not unfriendly, and made it clear in about 20 minutes that the shape of the analytics function going forward was not yet determined, and that I should continue current priorities while that determination was being made. Current priorities, I said. What you were working on before, she said. Most of what I was working on before was distributed across the team, I said. Then prioritize what you can, she said, which was technically advice. I went back to my desk and spent the afternoon making a list of everything the team had been responsible for and dividing it into 3 columns: things I could do alone, things I could not do alone, and things I was not sure about. The first column was shorter than I expected. The second was longer. The third was the longest and the most honest. What I was left with, functionally, was a job that had been designed for 7 people and was now being performed by 1, without any acknowledged reduction in scope, and without any particular clarity about what success looked like. I want to be careful not to frame this as complaint, because it is not, or not only. It is context. The situation I was in was the situation, and understanding it required understanding that the organization had not, in retaining me, solved a problem. It had transferred one. The question I kept coming back to in the evenings, in the particular mental space that opens up when you are new to living alone with a significant work situation and have no team to decompress with, was the one I had asked Philip in the conference room and not received an answer to. Why me? It was not, I want to be honest, an entirely comfortable question. There are 2 ways to ask, why was I the one they kept, and they pull in opposite directions. The first is the version that feels like validation. They kept me because I was the best, the most valuable, the most indispensable, the one whose absence would have cost the most. The second is less comfortable. They kept me for reasons that have nothing to do with merit, reasons that are organizational or political or arbitrary, reasons that make the survival feel less like recognition and more like luck. And then there is a third version, which I did not think of immediately but which eventually became the most interesting one. They kept me for reasons I do not yet understand. And understanding those reasons might tell me something important about how organizations actually work versus how I had been telling myself they work. I chose to pursue the third version. This was partly intellectual curiosity, and partly the fact that I had 6 fewer colleagues and significantly more unstructured thinking time than I was used to. I started in the most straightforward way available to me by trying to reconstruct the decision. I could not ask Philip, who had made clear that the decision was above his level and who was not going to breach whatever confidentiality surrounded it. I could not ask Renata, who was new to overseeing me and who I had not yet established the kind of relationship where that question would land well. I could not ask Dana, my former manager, who was one of the 6 who had been let go and who I had exchanged one brief, careful email within the days after the Thursday, warm, without bitterness, the email of someone who is processing something privately and does not need my guilt added to it. What I could do was look at the evidence available to me, the 6 people who had been laid off and the one who hadn't. What was different about the one? This exercise was uncomfortable in ways I had not anticipated. When you begin to construct a comparative analysis of yourself against your former colleagues, people you liked, people you had eaten lunch with, people whose work you had admired, you are doing something that feels vaguely disloyal even when it is entirely private, even when the purpose is understanding rather than judgment. I had to keep reminding myself that I was not trying to justify the decision. I was trying to understand it. The first thing I noticed was seniority. I had been at Corvin for 3 years. Of my 6 former colleagues, 2 had been there longer: Derek, 11 years, and a woman named Sujin who had been there 7. The other 4 had been there between 8 months and 2.5 years. If seniority had been the deciding factor, Derek would have been the obvious choice. He wasn't kept, so seniority was not the primary variable, or not the only one. The second thing I looked at was role specificity. What did each of us actually do day to day, in terms of the specific functions we performed? This required me to think carefully about the team's actual structure, which was less clearly defined than an org chart would suggest. We had general titles but specialized in practice. Certain people were the de facto owners of certain processes or client relationships or internal tools. I mapped this out over several evenings, as carefully as I could from memory and from the project documentation I had access to. What emerged was a picture of 6 people who each owned something specific and irreplaceable, plus one person, me, who owned considerably less in that specific, irreplaceable sense, but had, over 3 years, developed something harder to diagram. I had worked across almost every function the team performed. Not as deeply as the specialists, but broadly enough that I was the person other team members came to when they needed to understand something outside their own lane. I was, in the informal taxonomy of how teams actually function, the connector, the person who knew enough about everything to translate between the people who knew everything about something. I sat with that realization for a while. It was not what I had expected to find. I had expected to find that I was, in some measurable way, the best at something. Instead, I had found that I was moderately good at many things and deeply integrated into the team's connective tissue in a way that was invisible until the team was gone. The organization hadn't kept the best analyst. It had kept the one whose absence would have made the remaining work most difficult to coordinate. It had kept the map, not the territory. I am going to tell you about the conversation with Derek, because it is the one that changed the shape of everything I had been figuring out. He reached out about 3 weeks after the layoff, a text message, which surprised me because we had been work friends rather than outside of work friends, and texting felt like a register we hadn't quite established. He asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes immediately, partly because I wanted to see him and partly because I had spent 3 weeks in an office that felt like a stage set for a play that was no longer being performed, and human contact with someone who understood the context was something I needed more than I had admitted. We met at a coffee shop near the office that we had both gone to regularly with the team, which in retrospect was an odd choice, a place thick with recent association, but neither of us suggested anywhere else, which I think said something about both of us. Derek was outwardly fine. He had already had 2 conversations with other firms. He was pragmatic about it in the way that people who have been doing something long enough to have perspective on it are pragmatic, not unbothered, but not derailed. He had a family, a mortgage, 11 years of contacts in the industry. He was going to be okay. He knew it and I knew it, and we both knew the coffee was not about that. We talked about the team for a while, where people had landed, who had heard from whom. Then there was a pause of the kind that happens when 2 people have been working up to the actual conversation and have arrived at it. "Can I ask you something directly?" I said. "You can always ask me something directly," Derek said, which was true about him and which was one of the reasons I had always trusted his feedback. "Do you know why they kept me?" He looked at me for a moment. Not with surprise, he had clearly expected some version of this question, but with the slight pause of someone deciding how honest to be. "I have a theory," he said. "Tell me." "You were the only one on the team," he said carefully, "who had a visible relationship with people outside the team." I waited. "The rest of us did our work," Derek continued. "We did it well, but we did it inside the team. You were always talking to people in other departments, product engineering, the client success managers, not because you were told to, just because you were curious about how things connected. You'd wander over to someone's desk and ask how their project was going, and then 6 months later you'd reference something they told you in a meeting, and people would think you were remarkably well informed." He paused. "You weren't remarkably well informed. You were just paying attention to things that weren't your direct responsibility." I sat with that. "The people who make layoff decisions," Derek said, "are not usually the people who know what the team actually does technically. They're the people who know what the team is seen to do, who knows about you, who mentions your name, who has worked with you outside your immediate context. When someone above Dana's level was thinking about which single person to keep, they were thinking about a name they'd heard, and your name was the one they'd heard." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not saying this to make you feel bad," he said. "I'm saying it because I wish someone had told me this 11 years ago." I drove back to the office after that coffee with Derek and sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes before going inside. Not because I was upset, I wasn't, or not in any simple way, but because I needed a moment to let what he had said settle into the existing structure of what I thought I knew about work, about value, about what it meant to be good at your job. The settling process was taking longer than 10 minutes. I went inside anyway. What Derek had described was not, on its surface, a complicated idea. Visibility matters. Relationships across an organization matter. Your reputation is built not only by the quality of your work, but by the number of people who are aware that the work exists. These are things that get said in management books and LinkedIn posts, and the kind of career advice articles that I had, over the years, read and absorbed, and then failed to fully integrate because they felt like soft variables in a world I had been treating as primarily technical. I was a data analyst. Data was either correct or it wasn't. Analysis was either rigorous or it wasn't. The quality of the output was the thing that mattered, and the quality of the output was measurable, and I had spent 6 years at 2 different companies, operating on the assumption that measurable quality was the primary currency of professional survival. Derek, who had 11 years of demonstrably excellent measurable output, was currently updating his resume. I was not. The data on my hypothesis was not encouraging. I want to be fair to my former self here, because I think the instinct is not wrong, it is just incomplete. Quality matters, rigorous work matters. Being genuinely good at the technical substance of what you do is not optional, is not replaceable by relationship building, is not something you can compensate for with visibility alone. The people I have watched fail professionally with great visibility and insufficient substance are a category I have observed enough to take seriously. But what Derek was describing was not a replacement for quality. It was the condition under which quality gets seen. I had been operating as though the work spoke for itself. The work does not speak for itself. The work is silent. The work sits in a shared drive or a dashboard or a report that gets read by 3 people or 30, and whether anyone above those 3 or 30 people ever develops an accurate model of who produced it, and why it matters, depends entirely on factors that have nothing to do with the work's intrinsic quality. It depends on whether someone mentioned your name in a meeting, whether you were in the room when the result was presented, whether the person who received the work understood it well enough to describe it to someone else, and if so, whether they described it in a way that included your name or just absorbed it into the general background of the analytics team did this. I thought about the previous 3 years through this lens, which was disorienting in the way that changing a fundamental interpretive framework always is. You see the same events but they mean different things, and the gap between the old meaning and the new one has the vertigo of a step you didn't expect. What I had done without intending to and without understanding what I was doing was build a network inside the organization that extended beyond my formal role. Derek had described it as curiosity. That felt right to me. It hadn't been strategic, hadn't been calculated. I had genuinely been interested in what the product team was building, had wandered over to ask questions, had ended up in a 3-hour conversation about user behavior data with a product manager named Yolanda that had led to a collaboration that wasn't in either of our job descriptions, but that had produced something useful. I had spent an afternoon helping the client success team understand a data export format because they had asked me in the hallway, and I hadn't had anything more pressing that afternoon. I had been to 3 all-hands meetings in departments that were not mine simply because the topics were interesting and the meetings were open. None of this had felt like career strategy. It had felt like being a person who was curious about the organization they worked in. What I understood now, sitting in my much quieter office in the weeks after the layoff, was that this pattern of behavior had produced a side effect I had not been tracking. I had become, without meaning to, someone that multiple people in multiple parts of the organization had a reason to think of as useful. Not as the analytics team in aggregate. As me specifically, Joel from analytics. Marcus from analytics. Sorry, in this story I'm Marcus. Let me stay consistent. The one who helped us with the export format. The one who worked with Yolanda on that user behavior project. The one who shows up to things he doesn't have to show up to. When someone above Dana's level was thinking about which analyst to retain, they were performing their own version of the exercise I had been doing in reverse, trying to identify which person, if absent, would create the most friction for the organization going forward. And the answer to that question was not the person who was best at the technical work. It was the person whose absence would be felt in the most places simultaneously. The one whose name came up when you asked other departments who they worked with in analytics. I had not built that deliberately. I had built it by being interested. The question that followed and that I spent considerable time with was, so what? What do you do with that understanding? Do you try to replicate it intentionally, to be strategic about the curiosity, to engineer the cross-departmental relationships, to manufacture the visibility? Or does the intentionality destroy the thing that made it work in the first place? I started in a tentative and somewhat self-conscious way to test both versions. The version that felt most natural was simply continuing to do what I had apparently been doing, being genuinely interested in the organization, showing up to things, asking questions, following the curiosity wherever it went. This did not require strategy. It required showing up and paying attention, which were things I had been doing anyway and which now felt, in the context of my newly reduced team, both more necessary and more possible. I had more latitude in how I structured my time, more space to operate outside the strict boundaries of the analytics function, and a mandate from Renata that was loose enough to accommodate some interpretation. The version that felt less natural was the deliberate one. There were things I could do intentionally that I had previously done accidentally, introducing myself to people and departments I hadn't worked with, attending meetings with the specific goal of being known rather than with genuine interest in the meeting's content, framing my work in communications that went to people above Renata rather than just completing the work and assuming it would be noticed. These felt, when I did them, slightly false in a way I found uncomfortable, not because they were wrong but because they were performed, because I was aware of the mechanism while operating it, which changed the quality of the thing in ways I couldn't entirely articulate but could feel. I eventually arrived at a position that I have refined over the subsequent years and that I want to try to describe accurately. There is a version of strategic visibility that is authentic and a version that is not, and the difference is not about the outcome but about the starting point. If you build relationships across an organization because you are genuinely interested in what those people are doing and what you might be able to offer each other, The fact that this also makes you more visible and more retained is a side effect, a real one, a valuable one, one worth understanding. If you build relationships across an organization, primarily in order to be visible and retained, the relationships will be thinner, the visibility will be shallower, and the whole structure will be less stable than you expect it to be when you need it. This sounds like a distinction that would be hard to maintain in practice, and it is. I am not claiming I always get it right, but I found in the months after the layoff that returning to genuine curiosity as the primary driver and letting visibility be the consequence rather than the goal produced better results on both dimensions than the deliberate version did. About 2 months after the layoff, I did something that was partly strategic and partly a genuine attempt to understand my own situation more clearly. I asked Renata for a meeting to discuss the scope of the analytics function going forward. This sounds ordinary, but it wasn't not for me. I had in my previous professional life been the kind of person who waited for scope to be defined from above rather than proposing it from below. I had been good at executing clearly defined tasks and less practiced at the act of walking into a senior person's office and saying, "Here is how I think this function should work, and here is the role I think I should play in it." That required a kind of assertiveness about my own value that I had not previously had the evidence to support, or had not believed I had the evidence, which amounts to the same thing. What had changed was not my skills. What had changed was my understanding of what I was actually providing. I had spent 2 months doing the work of 7 people at reduced scope, and in doing so I had developed a very clear picture of what the analytics function contributed to the organization and what it could contribute if resourced and structured correctly. I had data. I had a specific and concrete proposal. I walked into Renata's office with a document I had spent 2 weeks preparing and presented it as a business case rather than a personal ask. Renata read it in the meeting, which people rarely do. They usually take documents away and never return to them with the same attention they might have given them if they'd read them in front of you. She asked several specific questions, most of them good ones. At the end she said that some of what I was proposing was above her authorization level and that she would need to take it higher, but that the framing was useful and that she would get back to me within 2 weeks. She got back to me in 10 days. 2 of the 3 main proposals were approved in modified form. The third was declined for budget reasons that she explained in terms that made the declination feel like information rather than rejection. I was given a modest title adjustment and a salary increase that was smaller than I had proposed and larger than I had expected. I walked back to my desk and sat for a moment with the specific feeling of having asked for something directly and received something real in return, and I tried to remember whether I had done that before in a professional context, and found that I couldn't identify a clear prior example. I had been asking for things indirectly my whole career, through the quality of my work, through the hope that someone above me would notice and reward it, through the general faith that good work would eventually be recognized by a system that was paying attention. The system had not always been paying attention. The system had been paying attention to the people who showed up and said, "Here is what I'm doing, here is why it matters, here is what I need." The thing I have not yet told you, and which is probably the most uncomfortable part of the story, is what happened with Derek. We kept meeting for coffee, roughly every 3 weeks, in a pattern that started with the explicit purpose of the first meeting and gradually became something less purposeful and more just, the rhythm of 2 people who find each other useful to talk to. Derek got a new position about 6 weeks after the layoff, at a smaller firm where he was brought in specifically to build an analytics function from scratch, which was both a recognition of his capability and a better fit than Corvin had been in the later years. He seemed, when I saw him 2 months into the new job, genuinely energized in a way that I had not seen from him in some time. We talked about his new role, and about mine, and about the layoff and about the industry, and one evening, over beers rather than coffee, because the conversation had been going for 2 hours, and had moved into territory that beer was more appropriate for, he said something that I have thought about more than almost anything else from that period. He said, "I've been thinking about what I told you, about why they kept you." "I've been thinking about it too," I said. "I think I framed it wrong," he said. "I made it sound like a strategy, like you had done something clever, but that's not actually what I meant." I waited. "What I meant," Derek said, "is that you were interested in people, not in a networking way, just actually interested. You remembered things about people's projects that you had no reason to remember. You asked questions that weren't useful to you. You showed up to things because the thing was interesting, not because being there was useful." He paused. "That's not a strategy, that's just a way of being in a place." And it turns out that organizations can tell the difference, eventually, between people who are interested in them and people who are using them, and they respond accordingly. He took a drink. "The reason I wish someone had told me this earlier is not so I could have done it more strategically. It's because I spent 11 years being interested in my work and not very interested in my organization. And there's a difference. The work is the thing you do. The organization is the place you do it. If you're only interested in one of those things, you're only half present and people can feel it, not as a critique, just as a kind of distance. I sat with that for a while. I thought about 11 years of excellent work done at a distance from the place where it was being done. I thought about what that cost, slowly and invisibly, over time. Do you regret it? I asked. No, Derek said without hesitation, because the work was real. I don't regret the work. I just understand now that the work was never the whole thing. The 6-month mark arrived in a way that felt both sudden and overdue, the way significant time markers always feel when you have been too occupied with the contents of a period to track its passage from the outside. I had started, sometime around month 4, to think of the post-layoff period less as a crisis I was surviving, and more as an education I had stumbled into without registering for it. This reframe was not entirely self-congratulatory. It was also a coping mechanism, and I am aware of the difference. But it was useful, and the things I was learning were real, and I want to try to describe them accurately rather than in the flattened, lesson-shaped way that experience tends to get packaged when it is retold. The most significant thing I was learning, the one that contradicted the largest number of assumptions I had been operating on, was about the relationship between being good at your job and being secure in your job. These feel like the same thing. They are not the same thing. They are related the way that being healthy and being insured are related. One supports the other, one makes the other more likely to matter, but they are not the same thing, and having one does not guarantee the other. I had spent 6 years, across 2 companies, operating on the assumption that professional security was a direct function of professional quality. You did good work, you kept your job. The mechanism was simple and the variable was within your control. The layoff had not disproved this exactly. The work quality of the people who were let go had not been the deciding factor. Dana had built a genuinely excellent team, and the excellence had not protected them. But the quality had not been irrelevant either. What the layoff had revealed was that quality was necessary but not sufficient, which is a phrase that is easy to say and surprisingly difficult to fully absorb when you have been living as though it were not true. What was sufficient, or rather, what quality needed to be combined with in order to produce something resembling security, was more complex than I had a framework for, and building that framework was most of what the 6 months had been. I had by this point talked to, in addition to Derek, 4 other former colleagues. Not in a systematic or research-minded way. I want to be clear that I was not conducting interviews, not building a study. I was just staying in contact with people I had worked with and liked, and the conversations kept returning to the same territory, because that territory was the shared geography of our recent experience. Sujin, who had taken a position at a non-profit and seemed genuinely lighter for the change, told me something that I had not expected, that in the weeks before the layoff she had known it was coming for her specifically, not through any official channel but through the texture of her interactions with leadership. Nobody above Dana had spoken to me in 4 months, she said, not meaningfully. I existed in the data but not in any conversation. When you don't exist in the conversation, you're already halfway gone. I thought about what she said in relation to Derek's comment about being interested in the organization versus interested in the work. Sujin had been intensely interested in her work. Her technical depth was extraordinary. Her outputs were consistently the most sophisticated things the team produced. She had been less interested in the organization. She had, by her own description, a low tolerance for what she called the performance layer, the meetings that were really about status, the communications that were really about visibility, the relationship building that felt to her like a tax on doing actual work. She had paid this tax minimally, rationally, as someone who found it inefficient, and she had been, by her own analysis, essentially invisible above a certain organizational level as a result. Do you think that's fair? I asked her. Fair is not the question I'm interested in, she said. The question I'm interested in is it true? And yes, it's true. Organizations are social systems. Social systems run on visibility and relationship and the continuous performance of presence. If you opt out of that performance, you opt out of the system. The system doesn't adjust for your preferences. Does that make you want to opt back in? I said. It makes me want to work somewhere where the performance layer is thinner, she said, which is what I've done. The non-profit is not perfect, but it's smaller and the distance between doing the work and being seen doing the work is much shorter. I don't have to perform for 17 layers of hierarchy. I can just be good at my job and have that be roughly sufficient. She paused, which is what I wanted all along. I just had to get fired to find it. There was something clarifying about that. Not as a universal prescription, not everyone could or should move to a smaller organization. And the non-profit sector came with its own complications, but as a diagnostic, the question of where you can be most fully yourself and still be professionally secure was not a question I had ever thought to ask explicitly. I had taken the environment as given and tried to optimize within it. Sujin had concluded that the environment itself was the variable worth changing. I want to tell you about the project that redefined my understanding of what I was actually doing in that post-layoff period, because I think without it, the story would feel like an extended meditation on professional theory, without enough concrete ground to stand on. About 3 months in, Renata asked me to put together a presentation for the quarterly review, a summary of the analytics function's output and its impact on business decisions over the previous quarter. This was not a new type of request. The team had produced these quarterly. What was new was that she asked me to present it directly to the executive team, rather than summarizing it for her to present, which had been the previous arrangement. She framed this as a vote of confidence, which I believed, and also as practical efficiency, which I also believed. I had never presented to the executive team, not once in 3 years, despite producing much of the work that informed their decisions. The work had traveled up through Dana, then through her manager, arriving at the executive level in a form that was accurate but attributed to the analytics function, rather than to anyone specifically. I had been in the organizational communication chain, invisible by default. The presentation itself was not, objectively, extraordinary. It was a competent summary of 4 months of work, clearly structured, with findings that were relevant and a recommendations section that was specific and actionable. What was different was the room, and being in it, and having to field questions directly from people who were seeing my face for the first time, while hearing analysis they had presumably been receiving in distilled form for 3 years. There was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when the CFO, a woman named Harriet who had a reputation for asking questions that were either incisive or impossible depending on your preparation, said, "This trend line here, walk me through the assumption." I walked her through it. She asked a follow-up. I answered it. She looked at the slide for another moment and then said, to no one in particular, "This is the clearest I've understood this data in 2 years," and moved on to the next question. I finished the presentation and went back to my desk and sat for a while with the quiet vertigo of having been, for 40 minutes, the person in a room rather than the person behind the work that the room was discussing. It was not a dramatic transformation. Nothing changed on the organizational chart. My title was the same, my salary was the same, my office was the same quiet space with 5 empty desks it had been since the Thursday. But something had shifted in how I was held in the organization's awareness, and I could feel it in the small signals that followed, the emails that now came directly to me rather than to the general analytics inbox, the invitations to meetings I had not previously been invited to, the 2 senior managers who stopped by my desk in the week after the presentation to ask, casually, whether I had bandwidth for a specific question. Harriet herself sent me a short email 2 days after the presentation. It said, "Good work, I've added you to the distribution for the Monday brief." The Monday brief was an executive-level summary that went to about 12 people in the organization. I was now one of 13. I read that email and thought about Derek, and about 3 years of work that had been good and invisible, and about the 40-minute window in which the visibility had been turned on. There is a thing that happens, I found, when you begin to understand a system more clearly, a temptation to become cynical about it. To decide that the system is purely political, that quality doesn't matter, that professional survival is a performance, and the performance is what gets rewarded, and the work is just the background against which the performance happens. I watched myself move toward this position at various points in the 6 months, and I want to be honest about why I rejected it, because I think the rejection matters as much as the insight. I rejected it because of Derek, specifically because of what Derek had said about the work being real. He had spent 11 years doing excellent work in relative organizational invisibility, and he had been laid off, and he had gone to a new organization where he was rebuilding an analytics function from scratch and doing it well. The quality of his work was the reason he had been hired. The quality of his work was the reason the new organization trusted him with something significant. The visibility failure at Corvin had cost him a specific job at a specific company. It had not cost him the capability, the reputation within the professional community that knew his work, or the career trajectory that work had built over more than a decade. The work had not spoken for itself inside the organization, but outside it in the industry, among the people who had collaborated with him, or reviewed his outputs or hired people who had worked with him, and heard their description of his standards, the work had been speaking continuously. His professional identity was not reducible to what Corvin's executive team had known about him. It was larger than that, distributed across a wider network of people who had their own direct experience of what he could do. This was another thing I had not properly understood, the difference between your internal organizational reputation and your external professional reputation. I had been treating them as essentially the same thing, which made sense if you planned to stay at one company indefinitely, which, as the Thursday had clarified, was not a planning assumption that the company shared. The external reputation was the more durable one. It was built more slowly, required more of the actual work rather than the performance of the work, and it was the one you took with you when the internal one became suddenly irrelevant. Derek had a strong external reputation. His internal one at Corvin had atrophied through 11 years of excellent isolation. The external one had carried him forward. The lesson was not to neglect the internal visibility, clearly, but to understand that it was one instrument in a larger system, not the whole system. to build both with the understanding that they required different things and served different purposes. Month 5 brought the clearest test of what I had been learning in the form of a conversation with a recruiter. She reached out on a professional networking platform, a straightforward approach, a company she was hiring for, an analyst role that was a step above my current position in terms of seniority and scope. The salary she mentioned in her initial message was meaningfully higher than what I was making. The company was one I knew by reputation, respected, and had no particular reason to avoid. It was, on paper, an upgrade. I responded because I had decided, after the Thursday, that I would always respond to serious professional outreach, not from restlessness or dissatisfaction, but from the principle that understanding your market value was part of managing your career responsibly, and that you could not understand your market value without periodically exposing yourself to the market. I had an initial conversation with the recruiter and then a first-round interview with the hiring manager, which went well enough that they moved me to a second round. Between the first and second round, I did something that I would not have done a year earlier. I had a direct conversation with Renata. I told her I was in a process with another firm. I told her I was not unhappy at Corvin and was not actively looking, but that the opportunity had come to me, and I thought being transparent with her was better than conducting a search in secrecy. I told her I would make whatever decision was best for me, but that I wanted her to know where I stood. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not immediately read. Then she said, "I appreciate you telling me. Can I ask what's driving the interest?" "Scope and compensation," I said. "The role is broader than mine currently, and the salary is higher." "Both of those are things I can potentially address," she said. "Not immediately and not unilaterally, but they're not off the table. Can you give me 2 weeks?" I said yes. She came back in 10 days. The offer was not a match. The other company's number was higher than what Corvin could authorize at my level, but it was closer than I had expected, and more importantly, the scope conversation had produced a real expansion of my role that was documented and agreed to in writing. I turned down the other offer and stayed. I want to be clear about why. Not because Corvin was better in every objective sense, but because I had spent 6 months building something there, an understanding of the organization, a set of relationships, a position that I had actively shaped, and the value of that was real even if it didn't show up on a salary comparison spreadsheet. What the process had done, regardless of the outcome, was change the terms on which I was sitting at my desk. I was no longer someone who had survived a layoff by luck and was managing the anxiety of an unclear future. I was someone who had been offered a position elsewhere, had negotiated a better situation at my current employer, and had made a deliberate choice to stay. The chair felt different under those conditions. Not more comfortable, the work was the same, the office was the same, the 5 empty desks were still there, but chosen rather than defaulted into. There is a significant psychological difference between those two things, and I underestimated it until I felt it. The 6-month mark came on a Thursday, which I noticed, and which felt like the kind of symmetry that life occasionally produces without meaning to. I was sitting at my desk in the same office, at the same computer, under the same fluorescent lights that the facilities team had been promising to replace with warmer LEDs for the better part of a year. The 5 empty desks were still there. Renata had floated the possibility of hiring at least one additional analyst, but the budget conversation was slow, and I had stopped tracking its progress on any particular timeline. The office was quieter than it had been a year ago. I had stopped noticing the quiet the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic when you live near a road long enough. I had been thinking in the days leading up to that Thursday about what the 6 months had actually changed. Not in the organizational sense. I had a broader role, a slightly better salary, a clearer understanding of my position in the company's decision-making structure. Those were real changes, and I did not want to minimize them. But the more significant changes were the ones that were harder to put on a resume or explain in a performance review. The changes in how I understood the thing I had been doing, without fully understanding it, for the previous 6 years. I want to try to describe those changes as accurately as I can, because I think the temptation in a story like this is to arrive at a set of clean lessons, numbered, actionable, the kind of thing that fits in a list, and I distrust that format not because the lessons aren't real, but because they aren't the shape of what I actually learned. What I actually learned was more like a shift in orientation than a set of instructions, a change in the angle from which I was looking at the same things. The first shift was about what professional value actually is. I had been measuring mine almost exclusively in outputs, the quality and quantity of the work I produced, the accuracy of my analysis, the usefulness of my deliverables. These remained important. They remained the foundation. But I had been treating them as the entirety of the structure when they were actually just the foundation, and a foundation without anything built on it is just a slab. What gets built on the foundation, the relationships, the visibility, the organizational context in which the work is understood and applied and attributed, was not separate from the value. It was the value being realized. The work unobserved was potential. The work in context was actual. I had been spending all my energy on the potential and almost none on the actualization. The second shift was about what security means in a professional context. I had been treating security as a property of a specific job, a thing you had or didn't have based on your performance and your organization's stability, and a set of factors largely outside your control. The layoff had demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that this model was wrong. Security was not a property of a job. It was a property of a person, of the specific combination of capability, reputation, relationship, and adaptability that you carried with you regardless of where you were working. Derek had lost a job and retained his security because his security had never lived in the job. It had lived in the combination of things he had built over 11 years that no single employer's decision could eliminate. The job was the current location of the security, not its source. This reframe sounds simple, and is actually quite difficult to fully internalize when you have spent years in a stable job that has become, without your noticing, the primary container for your professional sense of self. The layoff had cracked that container open and forced me to discover whether the thing inside it could survive outside it. It could. The discovery was uncomfortable and ultimately useful, and I would not have made it without the crack. The third shift was about what curiosity is for. I had always thought of my professional curiosity, my habit of wandering into adjacent departments, asking about projects outside my scope, attending meetings I wasn't required to attend, as a personal trait, something I did because I was wired that way, without particular professional significance. Derek had shown me that it had professional significance whether I intended it to or not. But the more I sat with that, the more I wanted to resist the version of the lesson that converted the curiosity into a tool, that said, in effect, be curious about the organization because it will make you more visible and more retained. That version was true in a narrow sense and wrong in a more important one. The curiosity that had made me visible had been genuine. The moment I started performing curiosity for strategic purposes, the currency changed. The relationships it produced were thinner. The knowledge it generated was less integrated. The whole thing had the quality of going through motions, which people can feel even when they can't name it. What the curiosity was for, I eventually concluded, was not visibility. Visibility was a consequence. What it was for was understanding, building an accurate model of the place where you spent a third of your waking life, understanding how it worked and what it was trying to do and who the people in it were and what they cared about. That understanding had practical value, yes, but more fundamentally, it was just the way of being fully present in a place rather than merely occupying it. And full presence, it turned out, was both more professionally effective and more personally sustainable than the alternative. The alternative, excellent isolation, as Derek had demonstrated, was expensive in ways that accumulated invisibly until they didn't. About 7 months after the layoff, I had a conversation with Yolanda, the product manager I had worked with on the user behavior project 2 years earlier, that brought several of these threads together in a way I hadn't anticipated. She had taken me to lunch, ostensibly to catch up, and we had been talking for about an hour when she said something that stopped the conversation briefly. She had been describing a hiring decision her team was making, a senior product analyst role, and she had mentioned, without particular emphasis, that she had recommended me internally as someone worth considering for it. "I'm not necessarily looking to move," I said. "I know," she said. "That's not why I mentioned it. I mentioned it because of why I recommended you, which is something I've been thinking about." I waited. "When we worked together on the behavior project," she said, "you were technically not involved in that work at all. It wasn't your scope. I asked you a hallway question and you spent 3 hours helping me think through something you had no obligation to think through. And the output was better because of those 3 hours than it would have been without them." She picked up her water glass. "I've worked with a lot of analysts. Most of them, when you ask them a hallway question, give you a hallway answer, quick, bounded, enough to answer the literal question and no more. You gave me something different. You gave me the question behind the question." "What do you mean?" I said. "I asked you how to read a specific data export. You answered that, but then you said, 'Can I ask what you're actually trying to figure out?' And I told you. And you spent the next 2 hours helping me figure it out in a way that the data export couldn't have gotten me to on its own." She set down her glass. I remembered that. 2 years later, when someone asked me who in analytics they should talk to, I said your name without thinking about it. Not because you were the most technically advanced analyst I'd worked with, because you were the most useful one, and useful is different from technically advanced. I thought about that word for a long time after that lunch. Useful. It was not a glamorous word. It did not appear on performance reviews in the categories that got rated on a 5-point scale. It was not what people meant when they talked about excellence or expertise or high performance. But it was, I was coming to understand, the actual currency of organizational life, the thing that, when present, created the web of relationships and references and quiet reputation that constituted professional security in its real form. Not the credential, not the output metric. The answer to the question, when someone in this organization needs something, do they think of you? The answer had to be earned through the behavior Derek had described, and Yolanda had just illustrated. The willingness to go past the literal question to the question behind it. The willingness to spend time on something that is not your scope, because the human asking is a person whose work matters and who could use your particular way of seeing. The willingness to be curious enough about the organization and the people in it that the connections you make are real rather than instrumental. You cannot manufacture this, you can choose to show up to it or not. I am writing this from a position that is, externally, not dramatically different from where I was before the Thursday. I am still at Corvin Group. I have a team again, 2 people, which is smaller than the previous team and which I have found, to my surprise, to be an appropriate size for the kind of work I am now doing, which is structured differently than the work the previous team did and is more directly connected to decision-making at the level where decisions get made. Derek was right that visibility changes things. It does, and the changes are real, and I do not pretend otherwise. But the thing I want to say, the thing that feels most important to say accurately, is that the 6 months did not teach me to be strategic. They taught me to be honest about what I was already doing and why it worked. The habits that had made me visible and retained were not clever. They were the natural expression of being genuinely interested in the place and the people I worked with. The lesson was not to do those things more deliberately. The lesson was to understand them clearly enough to protect them from the version of professional life that would convert them into tactics, because tactics corrode the things they imitate. I think about Derek, in his new role, building an analytics function at a company that had hired him specifically because they wanted his particular way of doing things. He had taken 11 years of excellent isolated work and built from it a reputation that survived the organization that had undervalued his presence. He was doing the most interesting work of his career at 44, in a role shaped around his actual capabilities rather than inherited from a previous structure. The layoff had freed him into something better. The excellent isolation had cost him a decade of internal visibility and given him, in exchange, a decade of deep craft that was now deployable on his own terms. I don't know which of us got the better deal. I genuinely don't. What I know is that neither story is the simple one, neither the visibility is everything story, nor the quality speaks for itself story. The real story is more uncomfortable and more interesting than either of those, which is that organizations are human systems and human systems reward a complex combination of things, and understanding that combination clearly, without either cynicism or naivety, is the actual skill that nobody teaches you and that a Thursday layoff, if you are paying attention, might. I was the one they kept. I spent 6 months figuring out why, and what I found was not what I expected to find, and it changed something real in how I understand the hours I spend doing work and the places I spend them in. The understanding did not arrive as a clean list of lessons. It arrived as a slow shift in the angle from which I was looking at something I had been looking at my whole professional life without quite seeing. I'm still looking, the angle keeps adjusting. I think that's probably how it's supposed to work.